everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a cardinal in acrylics. Now the first thing I'm doing here is just taking my Mars black and then just mapping in my darkest value. Now this is a smaller painting, this is only 5 by 7 inch because what I really wanted to focus this real-time tutorial, which is all linked in the description below if that's of interest, I really wanted to focus on how to capture a high level of realism when working on a smaller scale. Now in order to do this, the contrast is really important. Now this is something that I focus on for every single project, but when working smaller, if we don't have that space to add lots of detail, then we need to rely on the contrast to make that artwork look three-dimensional. Now as I continue to block in my layers here, you'll see that I'm starting off with a layer of titanium white. Now the reason for this, if I was to come straight in with the red, it's not going to be that vibrant colour that I want. It's going to show that grey background through and it really will lose its colour saturation. So by starting off with a layer of white, I can then wait for that to dry and then add my red on top, and that's going to make sure that colour is far more punchy. Now when I layer the red colours here, it's not accurate for this layer. I'm going to build up my colour and correct that with each stage. But what I really want to be focusing on here is just making sure, as always, that I've captured as much of that shape and form of the animal as possible. Now in the corner there is a photo of my finished painting, and you can see that it still has a high level of realism despite being a significantly smaller painting. Now how we use the brushes for each layer is important here because I don't want to force too much detail on a smaller scale because it can actually make the feathers look less realistic. So it's about getting that balance just right. However, as I'm building up my layers here, it's the contrast first of all that I'm focusing on. Now as I'm reinforcing this brighter highlight on the top of the beak and then coming in with this darker mixture to hint at the shadows at the base of the beak, this is here already giving that three-dimensional realistic look. Now if I had harsh start and stop points between my highlight and shadow, like the darker area under the eye there, you can see I'm coming in with this darker red, and that's already softened around the eye where the black meets the red. So by focusing on the values here, this is where we can capture more of that realism. We want to be making it look like that structure is curved. Now in order to curve that, this is where we need to be focusing on where the highlights and shadows are placed. If that highlight on the top of the beak was too low, then it's going to actually make the beak look squared off at the top rather than curved. So this is something that I always want to focus on regardless of the subject I'm painting. An example of this would be, let's say on a dog or a cat painting and you've got the highlights on the top of the eye socket. If they're positioned a little bit too high up, then it's going to make it look like the skull shape is taller. So it will, in the long run, make that face shape completely different to the reference photo we're working from. So regardless of the animal, it's something that I really do pay close attention to at each stage. Now the one thing that I do focus on for every single tutorial, I've got many examples here on YouTube, is my base foundation. So as you can see here, I'm coming in and darkening my values and it's already creating that three-dimensional shape. But yet there is no detail here at all. This is all still about getting that base foundation to the point where we can start adding our details on top, which is this layer here. So with this pink mixture, it's got a little bit of that grey tint to it. I'm coming in and just mapping in some of that base feather texture. Now my biggest tip at this stage is I wouldn't recommend to add your brightest highlights at this layer. We want to be building up those values gradually. You can see here this is my third layer of detail and I'm already now starting to get more of those highlights in place. But if I had started with this lighter mixture first, then I'm going to miss out on lots of layers of depth that could be achieved initially. Now when working on a smaller scale like this, the brush control is really important, and this is what one of the aspects of the real-time tutorial focuses on. You can see here that with this smaller detailed brush, I'm making sure that I'm trying to keep my lines really thin. I'm focusing on the length of my brush strokes and also the direction of my brush strokes. Now the brush technique in painting feathers, fur, skin textures, whatever it may be, this can actually make a big difference to what we're trying to replicate in our reference photo. I'm not particularly fussy with which paint brushes I use, but I do want to be making sure that whatever brush I'm using the right amount of pressure. I'm holding it in the right way. I'm moving that brush in a way that's going to replicate that accurate direction, and so on. All of these things here make a really big difference, and this is why my real-time tutorials are recorded with a voiceover while I'm painting. So I'm able to explain everything regarding each little decision that does make a big difference at the time. Now this makes even the more complex subjects more of a step-by-step lesson to follow along to. And I do also have lots of different animals there, so different markings, textures, colours and so on. And I do have a library that shows all of those tutorials that are available, which I will also link in the description below. Now if you are running into any issues with your acrylics, whether or not it's how to use a specific brush, maybe a layering technique, or maybe the consistency of the paint, then feel free to pop any questions in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now when working on elements like this where we've got multiple feathers in a very small section, I want to be trying to focus on the main feathers that I see rather than trying to paint in every single one. Now if I was doing this painting on a larger scale, then obviously I have that extra room to add those finer feathers. But here this is still going to look realistic as long as the contrast is right and I've made sure I've got the shaping of those feathers accurate, even if I haven't included all of them in the painting. Now at this stage here, this is very much about a process of simplifying that reference photo as much as possible. And again, this is something that I do cover thoroughly in the real-time version. Because of the number of feathers, especially on this wing, it can make it very confusing to which bit to paint first. So as I come in here, starting off with my darker red-purple mixture, where I am just hinting at some of those individual feathers, I can come in now with my white paint where I'm eventually going to turn it red, and this has already helped to simplify that section. Now when working on more complex areas, I do find that working in smaller sections really beneficial. I personally don't like working with whole individual layers because I feel I am going to rush through that layering process. Now of course that really is individual to each artist, but if you do feel that you're looking at your reference photo and you're hesitating, not quite sure where you should be, then that is an indication that the area is a little bit too large. And sometimes if I get that feeling where I'm starting to get a bit overwhelmed, I will only work on 1 square inch at a time. Now although I've mapped in the main lights and darks of those feathers and then I added the red on top, you can still see those darker lines that I put in first. So that step there has really helped to simplify it. If I'd have started working with those reds first and then tried to map in the feathers, I just think it makes the process more complex than it needs to be. But of course there are many different ways to get to the same end. Now at this stage I'm already getting a bit more of that three-dimensional feel because I'm focusing on the shading and the values. I've got a subtle shadow on that chest area and then at the bottom of the wing. This is going to help create that impression that the wing is sat on top of everything else, which is going to aid with that level of realism. I can then wait for that layer to dry and then continue with my highlights where I'm adding more of the depth. Now a big tip here is when you are using your vibrant colour over the top of your white, it's really important to make sure that the white is dry. Because if that red is added too soon, then it's going to mix with the white and we're just going to get a pink. So that colour saturation will then be affected. And although it's at this stage, it looks a little bit odd because I am coming back in with my white and this bird doesn't have any white feathers. It's all because I'm then going to add my red back over the top to enhance that colour saturation. Now one other reason why I've started to incorporate more of these smaller projects for my real-time tutorials is because they can really help to overcome that feeling of being burnt out. Now this is something that I've spoken a lot about with many artists recently. And having that feeling where we want to create but we don't know where to start, or if we're starting to feel a bit overwhelmed and we're reluctant to be at the easel, that's something that can then have a real negative effect with the art that we're creating. Now I find one way of working through that is to fit in these smaller projects in between our larger or more complex pieces. Now the reason being is this is something here where I was able to get this painting done in a few hours, in one painting session. So having that sense of achievement a lot earlier on, compared to a project that might take multiple days or weeks to complete, we're able to have that sense of, okay, I finished that and I'm really happy with the end result. and it has only taken a few hours to achieve it. I just find that this is something that can make a huge difference to our mindset, and I'm always then wanting to look forward to planning the next project. Now, I personally used to get this burnt out feeling when I was first newer to painting and drawing, and the reason being is I always picked something that was challenging because I was always wanting to push my painting and drawing skills. Now, this is great, this is a good way to learn. However, it can have a negative impact if every single project is always requiring a lot of concentration and that patience to be able to work with that technique that we're finding quite difficult. Now, when working on smaller paintings like this, every single technique is still used, but it's on that smaller scale. We're still layering, we're focusing on contrast, we're focusing on brush technique. It's everything here that is valuable that can be transferred to our larger and more difficult pieces. And because we are having to use that brush in a smaller area but still get a realistic look, this is actually going to improve the control that we've got with the brush, which is so beneficial for our larger pieces. Now, to finish this painting off, I'm just here working on the twig, and what I really want to be focusing on here is making sure that it is replicated correctly, that that bird is perched on this branch. Now here, in order to do this, just a simple shadow is going to be really effective, but I need to be making sure that the shadow is dark enough. If it's not, then it's not going to have that impression that the bird is sat above it, so I want to be really focusing on that lighting. And then when I worked on this, I'm really focusing on the layering order. So there is going to be a little bit of snow on the very top that I'm starting to hint at here. But because that is sat on top of this twig, I needed to make sure the twig was finished first. Now, when adding the snow, it's really important to make sure that we don't add too much. This twig would be very, very small because the relation of the size of this compared to the bird. So I just wanted to make sure that I hinted at a little bit that would just be sitting on the very top. Now, finishing off with this, I just wanted to add some more individual snowflakes that were also in front of the bird as well. This would really help with the depth and also help to push that background back a little bit more. Now, when painting the snowflakes, you can do this with your airbrush, or you can use your brushes and just soften out the edges as I am here. Now, I want to make sure that I add the snowflakes first, soften the edges, and then go back in to lighten the centre. This will give a really good impression of the fact that the edges are a little bit blurry and they don't look like polka dots. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in painting along to this or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then as I've mentioned, all of the information to those is in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.